So this is an overview of one of the 3 different types of essays you'll write on the AP exam. This essay type is the rhetorical analysis. And so the purpose of this presentation is just to talk you through what you're going to do when you write that in-class essay. Now, you've practiced with writing rhetorical analysis in different other modes before, but it's important we understand what it's like to write it for that actual timed essay. This is a different video from the video that overviews the rubric. So make sure you check out that video on the rubric as well, because that's really going to be important for you understanding what you're being assessed on. This is more about the strategies for how to approach writing that essay. So let's take a look. So the first thing you would want to be aware of is that I have made on Canvas 2 areas that you'd want to refer back to whenever we do rhetorical analysis practices. One of those areas is the Unit 1 rhetorical analysis that covered everything we did from that Unit 1 learning kind of discussion area. The second area you'd want to see in the modules is the one that says AP Exam Prep Rhetorical Analysis Prompt. That one gives you all of the kind of overview information. It gives you practice prompts. It gives you this video and other different resources that are going to help you there. If you scroll down further, you're going to see some different videos available. This one will be replacing this rhetorical analysis review before test spring version 2021, and it'll just be called rhetorical analysis review before test or something like that. So you can find it whenever you want. It's there. So let's go over a couple of those ideas. Number 1, you want to simply answer the question, who is saying what, about what, and why, to whom? So that's kind of the key thing you're thinking about in this rhetorical analysis, is you're going to get a prompt, and it's going to have something written on there, and you have to ask yourself, who's the speaker? What are they saying? So what's the tone of their whole narrative here? What are they talking about? What's the subject of this thing? Why are they talking about it, and to whom? If you can answer that question, that very basic, a little bit convoluted, but very basic question, you're going to be able to write this essay no problem. That's the key thing you have to do there. So, when we think about the subject, right, the subject is literally what is being spoken about. That's what we have to remember here. Just literally what is the topic of discourse. Is it school lunch menus and whether or not they're healthy? Is it bias within maybe the school system? What is the subject that is being discussed? Next, what is the tone? When we talk about tone, what we're talking about is the writer or speaker's attitude toward a subject, character, or audience, an attitude conveyed primarily through diction, imagery, figures of speech, details, and syntax. So once we have the subject, once we're aware of the subject, we can think about the tone. How is the writer approaching this subject? Because if you have, for instance, the company that runs the food in the cafeteria, if they're writing some kind of statement about cafeteria food versus a student who's eating that cafeteria food, you might have wildly different tones because despite those being the same subject, they're going to have a different tone toward that topic. And so then what matters more significantly is audience, right? Typically in an AP prompt, the audience is really straightforward and it's given effectively by the AP prompt. It'll actually say, you know, this person during this rhetorical situation wrote to this audience. So it will give it to you explicitly, and that gives you a lot of hint as to what you're looking for. Another thing to think about with audience is that different audience types require the speaker to utilize effective and varying strategies, as we've studied. So, again, going back to our lunch description, if it's a student complaining about the lunch menu on their campus, what are the different strategies they're going to use to appeal? It depends on the audience, right? If the audience are their peers, they're going to use certain tones, certain strategies, certain ideas to convey that to their peers. If it's the administration, they're going to also have to choose different strategies. For instance, they might need to kind of dress their language up and make sure that it is professional and it's to the point, right? It's logical it's a good argument. If it's to their peers, it might be more pathos-based, right? How you're just mad about this, or you're frustrated, or, it's inhumane what they're doing to us, right? So you can be more pathos-based. If you do that to a administration audience, right, your principal, your vice principals, it might not land the same way that you're hoping. Then it comes to our purpose, right? So we've talked about already our subject, we've talked about our audience, and now it's our purpose. Really what we want to think about there is the purpose is the goal of the speaker. What are they trying to do through this? So going back to our example of the student complaining about the food in the cafeteria. Their goal could be different based upon the audience. So if it's to their friends, their goal could just be, I want to complain to my friends and get this kind of like catharsis that comes with that complaint. If the complaint is to the administration at the school, it could be to make change, right? To say, we have to make things different here because we want change to have healthier food or whatever their purpose is there. Also, it's important to understand that there are different goals associated with purposes. So it could be to convince, to sympathize, to implore, to shame. Once you articulate the purpose, it really helps you understand what rhetoric is being utilized there. So I'll point you back to a really helpful resource that's under the module, and that's just memorizing this very kind of brief acrostic here, as it says there, this soapstone memory kind of device here. And if you memorize soapstone, right, that will help you when you go into the essay to say, okay, what can I write about? Because what will happen from time to time is, you will sit down for the essay and say, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to write about. So number one, if you remember that question at the beginning, who is saying what, about what, to whom, that helps. But then also soapstone can really help. And you can sit there and say, okay, who's the speaker? What's the occasion? Who's the audience? What's the purpose? What's the subject? And then what's the tone, right? All those things we've just gone over here. But this is just a quick memory device that helps you remember those things in case you sit down for the essay and you say, gosh, I really don't know what I'm going to say here. So how to approach the essay prompt, which is kind of what you're getting to. Number one, you want to be actively reading. When you get the prompt in front of you, you want to have your pen out and you want to be noting things that you see. If any language, for instance, comes up that's really emotional, that's really significant in the sense of any kind of constructions you memorized with those rhetorical devices, that's something I would note really quickly and say like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Number two, pay attention to the prompt for hints and context. Typically, the prompt will say something along the lines of like, this person wrote it to this person during these circumstances. And that can help you say like, oh, they must be asking for something. They must be appealing for the needs of their larger community. So again, if the prompt is a student writes to their school board about the unhealthy lunch choices, then in that prompt, I might notice that this should probably appeal to kind of this broader audience, right? And I can start to think, how does this student appeal to that broader audience, and look out for that as I read. Find convincing examples of the strategies used, right? And that's ultimately what you're looking for. As you're reading, try to find those best convincing examples of what you think the speaker is trying to do to the audience. So when we talk about those appeals, you might say, well, which ones do I use? I can't remember that. Here's kind of a breakdown of the ones that I see typically in these essays. So here's the logos appeals. These are all of them, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, that's so many. How will I know which ones to use? Well, here you go. This is the ones that I would look for most often. You're going to always find a definition. And again, I say always, maybe not always, but almost always, you're going to find a definition, right? That's where someone says something like, schools are places where students should be fed well. That's a definition. You're saying what school is. And by using that definition, you're forcing the audience to agree or disagree with you. And that's something you could write about in your essay. You could say, initially, the author utilizes a definition to make sure the reader is on page with what they're arguing. Then you're going to oftentimes find analogies, right? Similes, metaphors. So if the writer says something like, not allowing us to eat healthy food is torture, right? So they say it is torture. That's an analogy. Now, you might point out that it's a faulty analogy, right? You could point out that logical fallacy, or you could say it seems effective, right? Because maybe that speaker is writing to their peers as the audience. Now, to the administration at the school, that's probably not going to be very convincing, because the administration is going to say you're being hyperbolic, right? You're going over the top with that. Consequence, right? When we think about consequence, just think cause and effect. Okay, what's one thing that's happening that's causing another? That's a consequence. Oftentimes in writing, we'll say that, right? Because we're trying to make some kind of argument, and we'll say, if you don't do this, this will happen. So if we don't feed students healthy food, they won't be able to study well, right? So that's a consequence structure. So you could write about that. Testimony and precedent, you're going to see those oftentimes. Precedent's really good if you see it, and that's just where someone makes a statement about, an occurrence that affords, it's hard to say this without saying precedent again, but an occurrence that affords the speaker the ability to say, this has happened before, right? So this is the occurrence where this has occurred. So for instance, if it's the healthy lunch analogy there. So if the student said to the administration, we used to have salads, and students' GPAs were 1 point higher when we had salads. Don't you think that that is a good precedent for why we need to have salads now? Now, that's kind of a terrible example. And in fact, that might be less of a precedent and more of a consequence, maybe. But let me try a different one. So a precedent might be something like, we have had good food in the cafeteria before, and it was available for the same price. That precedent suggests that we should have healthy food now. Why isn't that the case? Okay, that's establishing that we once had this, we should have it now. And that's a precedent. Chronology is just when we go from any point in time to a later point in time, right? And that's usually how we set things up for readers. But you can see that oftentimes in writing, and so you can point out that chronology. And then lastly, counterargument. We study the counterargument in the rhetorical argument unit, and counterargument's really about offering the other side of the perspective. So those logos appeals you're going to almost always see available in a rhetorical analysis, and those are ones you can latch on to. And so instead of saying the author utilizes logos, which we don't want to do, right? That doesn't sound like you're analyzing it with a knowledge, because logos is a broad category. You can instead say the author utilizes definition, or the author notes a precedent that the administration should adhere to, or the author utilizes counterargument to point out the nuances in the discussion. All right, so our next one that you might look out for in a rhetorical analysis is pathos. And again, here are different kinds of pathos that you might see, and here are the ones that I would suggest you look out for. Let's see where those go. Excuse me, I moved ahead in my presentation. Apologies. So these are the ones that I would point out that you're going to see all the time. So sensory images and figurative language is just when the author utilizes images for the reader, right? And we're going to see that in almost all writing. The key thing I'd say there is make sure you specify what the image is doing, right? So if it's a frightening image, if it's figurative language that romanticizes something, just say what it does or what the image is, rather than just saying the author uses sensory images. That really doesn't say anything versus saying like it is, they're images that cause pain, or they're images that cause confusion, or they cause sadness. So what are those images actually doing there? And that's how it connects to pathos, right? It should be emotional. Then anecdote, so any kind of story, personal narrative, that kind of stuff. So if I say something like, oh man, I went into the lunchroom and I was about to eat, but they didn't have any healthy food. All that was sitting there was a gray, meat patty, and I'm a vegetarian, so I couldn't even eat that. And so what am I supposed to do, right? When it becomes all about the individual and that narrative is all about that person, that's an anecdote. Humor, I think you get. Diction is just word choice. Remember, if you write about diction, really you want to write about tone. And to write about tone, you want to talk about connotations, what the words evoke in a sense of feelings, and then denotation, what they actually mean. And then lastly, needs, right? And don't ever write that the author appeals to needs, right? Instead, you want to say what need they're appealing to. So the need to belong, for instance. The need to have healthy food. That is a need that all of us share. It's a human, it should be a basic right to have, basic food needs provided. Let's move on to the next one, which is ethos. The ones I put in here are shared values, credibility, authority, trustworthiness, and clear motives. We've talked about these a lot this year. The one thing I'd clarify with shared values is it's same to needs under pathos, and you want to clarify what value you're specifically talking about. So don't just write that the author utilizes shared values. Instead, you want to say the author appeals to the shared patriotism among the individuals, or the author appeals to the sense of justice among the group, or whatever else they might have that are actual values that we hold. Honor, integrity, peace, justice, all these things that are values that we say like, yes, we adhere to those things. Okay, then credibility. We talked a lot about credibility and authority throughout the year. Credibility is really what someone's given initially. So if, for instance, the writer of the essay is a president of the United States, they have credibility right away, right? They are the president and they have authority. However, that credibility can be diminished based upon the audience, based upon what's said, right? Even if that authority is never diminished, right? So a school principal might always have authority, but they might lose credibility based on what they do. That credibility has a lot to do with trustworthiness, right? How much do we actually trust the person? Even though they come in and they have this amazing credibility because they've done all these things in their life and they have the authority because of the position they're given, they can oftentimes lose trustworthiness, right? Because they've harmed that audience before, right? They haven't created that trustworthiness. And then clear motives is just, do you believe what they seem to be saying they're doing this for? Like, why are they doing this? What is the purpose of that? And is that clear for the reader? Or is it a little bit obscure, right? If you ever are in a situation where you feel like something's being sold to you, that's where a motive isn't totally clear. And you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? All right, some rhetorical devices. Now, you memorized all these rhetorical devices, and I'm going to give you probably more throughout the year. But here's my warning. Don't use them if you don't understand their purpose. This is not a situation where you want to fake it till you make it and just start throwing in like paralipsis or metaphor even, or rhetorical question, or asismus if you don't know what they actually mean. Just don't toss them in there. So, first of all, memorize them, get to know them, practice with examples like we did throughout the year. But second of all, the ones that I think can really help here are when we gather them together. So the rhetorical devices that compare here, or emphasize, or contrast, or draw in. So the first ones that compare are things like metaphors, analogies, and parallelism. Those compare ideas. So if you notice in the essay that you're reading that they're making comparisons, you might point out that metaphors are used frequently, or parallelism is used. That helps to compare something. To emphasize, you're going to see this a lot, right? Because if you're talking about how there are needs between the audience and the speaker, then they might have different emphasis going on. So whenever a writer uses alliteration or anaphora, desis, epistrophe, imperative sentence, periodic sentence, rhetorical question, or paralipsis, that might emphasize something, which often goes along with just repetition, which isn't in here, but that's one you might use frequently, because like alliteration and anaphora and epistrophe, those are all repetitions, right? But if you don't remember which one it is specifically, you could just write down repetition, and that can function too. To contrast, okay, so we have a compare one earlier. This is to contrast. Antithesis, apophasis, dilemma, juxtaposition, and oxymoron. Those all contrast because they are saying there's an opposite here. To draw in, right? So if your speaker is trying to bring in the audience, they might use an allusion. They might use a paradox. They might use a rhetorical question. They might use anthypophora. Just going to move on. So, that's a lot of review because we've done a lot of stuff. And you're going to have 40 minutes where you're sitting down and writing an essay. So you should be asking the question, so how do I approach this? You just went over all the things that are available to rhetoric. First thing is, go back to that initial question. You get the essay, you read the prompt, and you say, who is the speaker? What are they saying? To whom are they saying it? And what is their goal? Then you sit down and you say, okay, they seem to be writing this about this for this goal. How do they do that? Okay, what elements of logos, ethos, pathos? Identify some of those, make sure they support your thesis, and articulate it from there. An analogy that I'll give you is if you approach a closet and you say, well, what do I wear? You have many options, right, of what you're going to wear. Similarly, in a rhetorical analysis, you have many options. But with the analogy of the closet, you can only choose some of them, right? You have to get to school or to work or whatever. So you ultimately have to say, fine, I'm just going to put this outfit on and move forward with it. And that's kind of how I recommend you do this rhetorical analysis, is read through the prompt, identify things that stick out to you, make sure you're really identifying the purpose of that writing, and then articulate it and go forward with it. If you suddenly notice at minute 35 that there's like this anaphora, but it doesn't really fit in your discussion, don't worry about it. Okay, you've already chosen it. You are moving forward. Don't worry about suddenly trying to choose something else, right? So, find the context, find the purpose, find evidence that establishes that purpose, and then write, typically chronologically, about how the speaker achieves the purpose. Find the context in the text. Find the purpose. What is the speaker trying to do? Identify evidence that establishes that purpose of what the author is trying to do. And then chronologically. So at the beginning of their essay, midway through their essay, at the end of their essay, explain how the speaker achieves the purpose. Alternatively, if you don't want to do it chronologically at the beginning, at the middle, at the end, you could also say one way they do this, another way they do this, and another way they do this, right? So you're just stacking 3 different ways that they achieve, again, the purpose. The key thing is that you establish that purpose. So that is a lot of stuff to go over, right? I don't want to try to overcomplicate it, and I know this is review, but the key is that you take your time to read through the prompt and ask yourself, what is the speaker trying to convey to the audience, and what is their purpose? And you're analyzing that relationship that's going on there. Of course, I'm always available to walk you through this, to help you through this. The first couple times you do an in-class rhetorical analysis is a little bit jarring, and you just kind of have to go with it, do your best, but you'll get the rhythm. You'll start to see and understand what works and what doesn't work.